Before we begin, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what you are about to hear is not fiction. This is not Hollywood. This actually happened. A young American paratrooper was officially declared killed in action in Normandy. His family held a funeral. His name was carved into memorial stones, but he was not dead. He escaped from the most brutal prison system in human history, crossed enemy lines on foot through a frozen wasteland, and somehow convinced a Soviet tank battalion to let him fight. He became the only American soldier in history to serve in combat with both the United States Army and the Soviet Red Army. No one else has ever done this. Stay until the very end of this story, because the final twist will leave you speechless. And right now, write in the comments which city, state, or country you are watching from. Let us see how far this story travels. June 5, 1944. Inside the belly of a Curtiss C-47 Skytrain transport aircraft over the English Channel, 30 young men sat shoulder to shoulder in full combat gear. The roar of the engines made conversation impossible. Joseph Beyrle sat near the door, 20 years old, born and raised in Muskegon, Michigan. 2 years ago, he had been working in a factory. Now he was a sergeant in the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division. Around his neck hung 2 metal identification tags stamped with his name, serial number, blood type, and religion. The plane began to shake violently. Flak. German anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. The plane lurched and someone near the front vomited. Joseph kept his eyes forward, focused on the red light near the door. When that light turned green, they would jump. The light changed. The jumpmaster screamed an order barely audible over the noise. Joseph hooked his static line and shuffled toward the door. The wind hit him like a fist. He stepped into the void. His parachute yanked open with a jolt that felt like his spine might snap. He looked around. The drop was scattered. Men were spread across miles of countryside. Tracers arced up from the ground. He heard the distant rattle of machine guns. Joseph hit the ground hard, rolling as trained, but the impact drove the air from his lungs. He released his harness, dragged his chute into a hedgerow, then crouched and listened. Nothing. No voices. No movement. He clicked his cricket. Click-clack. Click-clack. No response. He was alone in occupied France with no idea where his unit was. For 3 days, Joseph moved alone through the Normandy countryside. He hid during daylight hours in ditches and abandoned barns, sleeping in short intervals, always listening for the sound of boots or vehicles. At night, he moved through fields and hedgerows, avoiding roads, wading through streams that soaked him to the bone. The Norman countryside in June was a patchwork of small fields divided by ancient stone walls and dense hedgerows that could hide an entire company of men. Every shadow could be an enemy. Every sound could mean death. He found telephone wire strung along fence posts, connecting German units. He had been trained for this. He pulled out his knife and cut the wire in multiple places, then moved quickly away before patrols could investigate. On the second night, he discovered a small supply depot guarded by 2 soldiers who were smoking cigarettes and talking in low voices. Joseph watched them for 2 hours from a ditch 30 meters away, memorizing their movements, waiting for the right moment. When both guards moved to the far side of the building, Joseph crept forward, set explosive charges on fuel drums, activated the timer, and disappeared into the darkness. The explosion came 10 minutes later, lighting up the night sky like a sunrise. He was already a mile away, moving fast through a forest. But his body was failing. He had eaten nothing but a few handfuls of grain stolen from a barn. His canteen was empty. His hands shook. His legs felt weak. He knew he could not continue much longer without food and rest. On the 4th morning, exhaustion overrode caution. He approached a farmhouse hoping to find food or perhaps friendly French civilians who might help him reach American lines. He should have watched longer. He should have circled the property, checking for signs of German occupation. But fatigue makes men careless. He was 50 feet from the door when German soldiers stepped out of a barn behind him with rifles leveled at his chest. They searched him roughly. One soldier found his dog tags, held them up to read the names stamped into the metal, then slipped them into his own pocket as if they were a trophy. Joseph opened his mouth to protest, but a rifle butt slammed into his stomach, and he doubled over, gasping, tasting bile. They tied his hands behind his back with wire that cut into his wrists and shoved him toward a military truck parked behind the barn. Other prisoners were already sitting in the back, Americans and British, all with their hands bound, all silent. Joseph climbed in and sat on the metal floor. The truck started moving, bouncing over rough roads, heading deeper into German-occupied territory. He did not know it yet, but the theft of those dog tags would kill him. Or at least, it would kill the man the world thought he was. The interrogation took place in a commandeered schoolhouse that still smelled faintly of chalk and children. The German officer who questioned him was professional, almost polite. He sat behind a wooden desk that was too small for him and spoke fluent English with a slight accent that suggested education in Britain or America before the war. He offered Joseph a cigarette. Joseph refused. The officer shrugged and lit one for himself. He asked about objectives, drop zones, troop strength, the location of other paratroopers. Joseph gave only his name, rank, and serial number, reciting them in a flat voice. The officer nodded as if he had expected this response. He asked the questions again, slower this time, enunciating each word carefully. Joseph repeated the same 3 pieces of information, nothing else. The officer sighed and stubbed out his cigarette in a glass ashtray. He stood, walked around the desk with deliberate slowness, and struck Joseph across the face with the back of his hand. The blow was not particularly hard, but it was sudden, and Joseph tasted blood where his teeth had cut the inside of his cheek. The officer returned to his chair and asked the questions again. Joseph said nothing. The officer made a note on a piece of paper, then gestured to the guards standing by the door. They grabbed Joseph by the arms and dragged him out of the room. The interrogation was over. He had given them nothing, but that would not save him from what came next. He was transported deeper into Germany by truck and then by train, moving through a landscape of bombed cities and scorched fields. The prisoners were packed into freight cars designed for cattle, not humans. There were no seats, no toilets, no windows. 50 men stood pressed together in a space meant for 20. The air grew thick and suffocating. When the train stopped at stations, guards would slide the doors open just enough to throw in buckets of water and stale bread. Men fought over the food. Some collapsed from exhaustion or dehydration and could not stand again. When the train moved, their bodies were propped up by the press of other men. When it stopped, the dead were dragged out and left beside the tracks like discarded cargo. Joseph stayed on his feet by wedging himself into a corner and locking his knees. He counted the hours by the rhythm of the rails. Days blurred together. He was eventually processed into the prisoner of war system at a transit camp in eastern France. His name was recorded in a ledger by a German clerk who wrote slowly and carefully in neat script. His photograph was taken, a gray image of a hollow-eyed young man who looked 10 years older than his age. He was assigned a prisoner number. Under the Geneva Convention, the Germans were required to report the names of all prisoners to the International Red Cross, which would then notify the prisoners' home countries. This was supposed to ensure that families knew their loved ones were alive. But something went wrong. Perhaps the paperwork was misfiled. Perhaps it was deliberately sabotaged by a clerk who hated the system. Or perhaps it was simply lost in the chaos of a collapsing empire that could no longer manage its own bureaucracy. Whatever the reason, Joseph's name never reached the Red Cross. His family would never receive notification that he was a prisoner. As far as official records were concerned, he had simply vanished. Meanwhile, the soldier who had stolen Joseph's dog tags was killed 3 days later in a skirmish near Cairnton. A mortar round landed in his foxhole and the explosion tore his body apart. When the American Graves Registration Unit recovered the remains, they found the dog tags still around his neck, intact and legible. The tags identified the dead soldier as Sergeant Joseph Beyrle, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, United States Army. No one questioned it. Dog tags did not lie. The body was buried in a temporary cemetery. The paperwork was filed. The telegram was prepared. The report was filed. The telegram was sent. In Muskegon, Michigan, on a warm afternoon in late June, Joseph's mother was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard a knock at the door. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked through the living room, wondering who would be visiting at this hour. When she opened the door, she found a young man in a Western Union uniform standing on her porch holding a telegram. She knew what it meant before he said a word. Every mother in America knew what a telegram from the War Department meant. Her hands trembled as she took the envelope. The courier tipped his cap and walked away quickly, as if he could not bear to watch what happened next. She stood in the doorway and opened the envelope with fingers that felt numb. The words were typed in capital letters, stark and official. The Secretary of War regrets to inform you that your son, Sergeant Joseph Beyrle, was killed in action on June 10, 1944, in France. He died in service to his country. His sacrifice will not be forgotten. Further details will be provided as they become available. Please accept our deepest condolences in this time of grief. She read it twice. Then her legs gave out and she sat down on the floor in the hallway, still holding the telegram, unable to move or speak or cry. She simply sat there, staring at the words, trying to make them mean something different than what they said. Her husband came home from his shift at the foundry an hour later and found her still sitting in the same spot. He read the telegram without saying anything. Then he sat down beside her on the floor, and they stayed there together in silence as the afternoon light faded into evening. The funeral was held at St. Joseph's Catholic Church on a gray Saturday morning. The pews were filled with neighbors, friends, co-workers, teachers who had known Joseph as a boy. There was no casket. The Army had informed the family that their son had been buried in a temporary military cemetery in Normandy and would eventually be reinterred in a permanent American cemetery overseas. The priest spoke about sacrifice and honor and the promise of resurrection. Joseph's mother sat in the front pew and did not hear any of it. She stared at a photograph of her son in his uniform, the same photograph that now sat on the mantelpiece at home, and tried to remember the sound of his voice. His name was printed in the Muskegon Chronicle in the daily casualty list that ran on page 3. Beyrle, Joseph R., Sergeant, United States Army, killed in action, France. It appeared between the names of 2 other local boys who had died the same week. His name was added to the honor roll at Muskegon High School, carved into a wooden board in the main hallway. Later, it would be transferred to a bronze plaque and then to a granite memorial. Joseph Beyrle was dead. The town mourned him. His family buried him in their hearts, and the world moved on. But Joseph Beyrle was in Stalag 12D near the German city of Trier, very much alive, and beginning to understand that survival in this place would require more than just endurance. The camp was a sprawling complex of wooden barracks surrounded by double rows of barbed wire fences and watchtowers manned by guards with machine guns. It held thousands of Allied prisoners, mostly British and American, separated by nationality and rank into different compounds. The conditions were designed to break men slowly. Food was rationed to just enough to keep prisoners alive, but too little to maintain strength. Each man received 1 bowl of thin soup and a piece of black bread per day. The soup was made from potato peels and whatever scraps the Germans could spare. The bread was mixed with sawdust to make the flour stretch further. Men were constantly hungry, a gnawing emptiness that never went away, that made sleep difficult and thought sluggish. Water was scarce and often contaminated. Sanitation consisted of open-pit latrines that bred disease. Typhus spread through the barracks like wildfire. Dysentery left men too weak to stand. Pneumonia killed quickly in the unheated barracks during the cold months. Every morning the dead were carried out and stacked near the gate like cordwood, waiting to be buried in mass graves outside the wire. The guards kept count but showed no emotion. Death was routine. Joseph watched men give up, saw the light go out in their eyes days before their bodies stopped functioning. He decided he would not be one of them. He began to study the camp with the same intensity he had once studied maps before the jump into France. He watched the guards, memorizing their schedules, noting which ones were vigilant and which ones were lazy or drunk. He observed the patterns of daily life, the times when roll call happened, when food was distributed, when work details left the camp and returned. He examined the fences, looking for weak points, places where the wire might be cut or climbed. He talked to other prisoners, especially the ones who had been there longest, who knew the routines and the dangers. Some had attempted to escape and been caught. They told him what mistakes they had made. Others had seen successful escapes and could describe how it was done. Joseph listened to everything and began to form a plan. His first attempt was born of desperation more than careful planning. He was assigned to a work detail that left the camp each morning to cut timber in a nearby forest. The guards were Wehrmacht regulars, not SS, and they seemed more interested in staying warm than in watching prisoners closely. On the 3rd day, as the column marched along a dirt road, Joseph lagged behind slightly, letting the distance between himself and the next man increase. When they passed a deep drainage ditch, he dove into it and pressed himself flat against the muddy bottom. The column marched past. He waited, heart pounding, expecting shouts and gunfire. Nothing happened. He waited 5 more minutes. Then he began to crawl through the ditch away from the road. He almost made it. He covered nearly half a mile before he heard barking. The guards had noticed his absence and released the dogs, German shepherds trained to track and attack. Joseph abandoned the ditch and ran for a tree line he could see in the distance. His legs were weak from malnutrition and his lungs burned. The barking grew louder. He reached the edge of the forest and kept running, branches tearing at his face and uniform. The dogs were faster. They brought him down 30 meters into the woods, one of them clamping its jaws on his left calf, while the other went for his arm. He tried to fight them off, but guards arrived within seconds and beat him with rifle butts until he stopped moving. They dragged him back to the camp by his arms, his legs trailing behind, leaving a track of blood in the dirt. The punishment was severe. They threw him into solitary confinement, a concrete cell barely large enough to lie down in, with no light, no blanket, and 1 meal every other day. The meal consisted of a piece of bread and a cup of water, nothing else. He spent 2 weeks in that darkness, losing track of time, unsure if it was day or night, talking to himself to maintain sanity. When they finally released him, he had lost 15 pounds from an already emaciated frame and could barely walk. Other prisoners helped him back to his barracks and gave him portions of their own meager rations to help him recover. But he had not lost the will to try again. If anything, the punishment had hardened his resolve. His second attempt came 3 months later. He and 2 other men cut through the fence at night during a rainstorm. They made it 5 miles before being caught at a roadblock. The punishment was worse. He was sent to Stalag 9C near Bad Sulza, a camp with stricter security. It was winter now. Men froze to death in their bunks. Joseph tried to escape again and again. After his fifth attempt, the Germans transferred him to a Gestapo prison in Berlin. There were no Geneva Conventions in Gestapo cellars. Joseph was chained to a chair. They beat him for hours. They broke his ribs, his nose, knocked out teeth. They wanted names of accomplices. Joseph had nothing to give. After a week, they stopped and threw him back into a cell. After 2 months, he was transferred to a labor camp near Schernau. The work was brutal, cutting timber 12 hours a day, but Joseph was still alive and still planning. In early January 1945, the camp was evacuated as Soviet forces approached. The Germans marched prisoners westward through snow and ice. On the 4th day, during a snowstorm, Joseph slipped away from the column and ran into the forest. He kept running until he could no longer hear the sounds of the march. Then he collapsed in the snow. He had no food, no map, no compass. He was deep in occupied Poland in the middle of winter, but he was free. He got to his feet and started walking east toward the sound of Soviet artillery. He walked for 2 weeks, scavenging frozen potatoes from abandoned farms, drinking snow, sleeping in barns. He saw German columns retreating westward and hid until they passed. The sound of artillery grew louder. On a gray morning in late January, he crested a hill and saw Soviet T-34 tanks moving in a long column. He waved his arms and shouted in English that he was an American. One tank stopped. A soldier climbed out and leveled a submachine gun at Joseph's chest. More soldiers surrounded him, weapons raised. Joseph had no identification. He was a skeleton in rags who claimed to be an American soldier. He could easily be a German infiltrator. One soldier raised his rifle and aimed at Joseph's head. A woman's voice cut through the argument. A Soviet tank commander named Alexandra Samusenko pushed through the soldiers and looked at Joseph. She asked questions. He answered. She had heard of American airborne forces. She gave an order and the soldiers lowered their weapons. She gestured for Joseph to follow her. He climbed onto her tank. Over the next several days, Soviet officers questioned Joseph repeatedly. Alexandra believed his story and advocated for him. She asked if he wanted to fight alongside them. Joseph said yes. They gave him a Soviet uniform, a PPSH-41 submachine gun, and food. Then he climbed onto a tank and went to war again. The Eastern Front was different from anything he had experienced. Soviet tactics relied on speed and overwhelming force. Tank battalions pushed forward aggressively, bypassing strong points, encircling German positions. Joseph rode on Alexandra's tank, jumped off to fight, then climbed back on to keep moving. He fought in several engagements over 2 weeks. In early February, Alexandra's battalion received orders to liberate a prisoner of war camp near Kustrin. It was designated Stalag 3C when the tanks rolled through the gates. Joseph realized where he was. He had been imprisoned here. Now he was returning as a liberator. The German guards had fled. Prisoners emerged slowly, skeletal figures unable to believe what they were seeing. Joseph walked among them in his Soviet uniform. Then someone recognized him. "Beyrle, Joe Beyrle, you are dead, mate. We got word. You were killed in France." Joseph shook his head. Other prisoners gathered around. Some of them knew him. They had heard the same report. And now here he was, alive, wearing a Soviet uniform, walking through the camp with the Red Army. In mid-February, the battalion was advancing near Zaydenik when German Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers appeared overhead. Bombs fell in a pattern. Joseph was on the back of Alexandra's tank when a bomb struck directly in front. The blast wave threw him backward. Everything went black. He woke in a Soviet military hospital with a concussion, broken ribs, and shrapnel wounds. Alexandra had pulled him from the wreckage and saved his life. During his recovery, Soviet officials asked questions. Eventually, word reached Marshal Georgy Zhukov. The Marshal requested a meeting. Zhukov listened to Joseph's entire story without interruption. When Joseph finished, Zhukov said through an interpreter, "You are either the luckiest man alive or the unluckiest. I have not decided which." Zhukov arranged for Joseph to be transported to Moscow and handed over to the United States Embassy. In early March, Joseph arrived at the embassy wearing a Soviet uniform. The receptionist looked at him as if he were insane. He had no identification. They questioned him for days. Finally, they agreed to check his fingerprints against records in Washington. The response took a week. The fingerprints matched. Sergeant Joseph R. Beyrle was officially alive. The original report had been in error. A second telegram was sent to Muskegon. The War Department is pleased to inform you that your son, Sergeant Joseph R. Beyrle, previously reported as killed in action, is alive and has been recovered in the European theater. Joseph's mother read it 3 times. Then she sat down and cried. Joseph was flown to Paris, then London, then across the Atlantic to New York. He arrived in April, 2 weeks before the war in Europe ended. Army intelligence debriefed him extensively. Then they sent him home. When he stepped off the train at the Muskegon station, his entire family was waiting. His mother ran toward him and he caught her. She was sobbing, her hands on his face, proving he was real. His father stood back, tears running down his cheeks. He was home. He was alive. Joseph R. Beyrle spent the rest of his life in Muskegon. He married, raised a family, and worked quietly as a civilian. He did not speak often about the war, but over time, recognition came. He was awarded the Purple Heart. The Soviet Union officially recognized his service with the Order of the Red Star and the Order of the Patriotic War. He became the only known American to receive combat decorations from both the United States and the Soviet Union. In 2001, his son John Beyrle was appointed United States ambassador to Russia. At the presentation of credentials in Moscow, John spoke about his father's service with the Red Army. It was a moment of symbolism, a bridge across decades of Cold War animosity. Joseph was in the audience, an old man now, watching his son stand in the place where he himself had once been a stranger asking for help. He died in 2004, at the age of 81, in the same town where he had been born. His story remains almost impossible to believe. A man declared dead by his own government, who escaped from Nazi captivity, who walked across a frozen war zone, who fought alongside a foreign army, who liberated the same camp where he had been imprisoned, who returned from the dead to a family that had buried him in their hearts. It is a story of endurance beyond reason, of chance encounters that changed everything, of decisions made in desperation that somehow led to survival. If you have made it this far, thank you. This story deserves to be remembered. If you found it powerful, please subscribe to this channel, leave a like on this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. What part of Joseph Beyrle's journey stayed with you the most? Was it the moment he was declared dead, the torture he endured, the impossible escape across Poland, the reunion with his family? Tell me what moved you. And tell me where you are watching from. What city, state, or country? Let us see how far the memory of one soldier's war can travel. History is not just dates and battles. It is people. It is lives. And this life, this one impossible life, reminds us that even when everything is lost, survival is still possible. Remember Joseph Beyrle. Share his story. Make sure it never fades.